Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Northwest Craftsman. Today we're going to be making a box out of finger joints. Now if you haven't seen our video on how to make a box with rabbet joints, go ahead and check that out right here. But otherwise, let's just go ahead and get started. So the first step to making your finger joint box is to measure out the dimensions that you want your box to be. In this case, I have already cut everything to the dimensions, but as a note, when you're measuring this, unlike the rabbet box, your dimensions for the finger joint box are going to be identical to the dimensions that you want. So for example, I wanted to have a 9 3/4 inch box by 13 1/2 inch box, and so I measured 9 3/4 by 13 1/2 because both of these guys are going to stick out to exactly the same width in the front and the back. It'll become a little bit more apparent as the joints get put in here, but the bottom line is whatever dimensions you want your box, cut your lengths and cut your widths to exactly those dimensions. Alrighty, next up what you're going to do is go ahead and take your finger joint jig. This is the one that I made in a previous episode. If you don't know how to make your own finger joint jig, go ahead and check it out. I'll put the link up here and down in the description. But this is really going to be the workhorse of the entire project so that you can cut your finger joints accurately. So go ahead and get this guy set up on your table saw, like that. Make sure that it slides without resistance all the way through, and now we got to get the height set. Alrighty, so the height here is going to be controlling, and when I say height, I really mean the depth of your dado blade. The height is going to be setting how deep your finger joints are going to interface with each other. And the really quick way to do it is you want to make sure that your finger joints are the same depth as the thickness of your board. So basically, as thick as this guy is, I want to make sure that my finger joints are going to stick just barely through to the other side. And rather than trying to measure and get it right, a really quick and easy way to do that is just to bring your workpiece up here, get it past the center point on your blade, and then lower it until it becomes just even with the surface. And that way when you're doing your finger joints, they will come just even with the surface on all parts. Here's what it looks like from the side. So as you can see here, it just barely comes over the top. I want this to be about as even as possible. Now, if you're gonna go through and you're gonna do a heavy sanding all the way around, you may want it to protrude just a little bit. Be careful if you're gonna try and plane these though, because you're gonna have a bunch of end grain showing, so you're gonna need to plane in from both sides rather than planing all the way across, otherwise you'll chip out your end grain. So I'm gonna leave it, these are a little bit more of a rough finish box for me anyways, so I don't mind if there's a tiny bit of finger showing, but that's why I wanted to try and get this guy dead even. Also important safety note, whenever you're touching your blade like this, make sure that it's unplugged because you can lose a finger really quickly if it happens to turn on and your knee kicks it on. Okay, so once I got the depth set up right here, I want to make sure that I'm cutting everything correctly. Because finger joints are a mirrored joint, you want to make sure that you're matching your joints up properly. To make this a little bit easier on myself, what I'm going to do is put the same joint on these long ones, so same orientation on both sides, and then the same orientation on both sides for these ones. That way I'm only cutting one at a time for both of these, and because I've got a long enough stub right here, I can actually put both of these on simultaneously to make sure that I'm getting each side cut. This side, then this side, and then I'm gonna switch over to these ones and do exactly the same thing. So here's what that process looks like. Okay, so a couple lessons learned as I was doing that portion. There's going to be a lot of tear out on the back portion, which is actually a good reason I did these both at the same time, because only then one of them get the tear out. If I was going to do this over again, I would put a sacrificial piece of wood right behind it that's going to take the brunt of any of this chip out. And in fact, you can probably just leave a piece stuck to that stub that I have right there so that it just supports the incoming work pieces so that you don't get this massive chip out. You probably would not run into this issue if you were working with a hardwood, but this pine, especially cutting the end grain, is just so soft that it just tears right out. So lesson learned next time, sacrificial piece of wood to support everything right behind it. Now let's go ahead and get the dry fit together. So you'll see that this little tiny nub right here matches up with this little tiny nub up at the top. So we should, assuming everything fits together right, yeah, should fit together nice and tight. And I'll explain what's going on with those finger joints here in a second. But then this guy here, fit here, and there you go. There is a dry fit finger joint box. So the reason why everything sticks out as much as it does over here is I forgot that when I designed my jig, I designed it to be a 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch, and because this is 3/8 inch whole wood, the problem I ran into is that I've got that extra 1/8 of an inch that's going to stick off on the side because my stub over here, the thing that's like right at the tip of my finger, that stub is too tall for this original thickness. And so what happened is I was actually sitting on top of the stub rather than sitting on the base of my fixture. So when you're designing this guy, make sure that you know what thickness that you want, what minimum thickness you want, because the height of that stub is going to limit your minimum thickness. Regardless, this actually looks fine, even though it's sticking out a little ways. I actually think it's kind of nice, but if I wanted to, I could go through and sand them all down to basically flat so that they're nice and flush all the way through, but we're gonna continue like this. So the next step that we need to do is decide which side is gonna be the bottom of the box, and for me, I am going to put this little tiny nub on the bottom because if it happens to break, I would rather have it on the bottom than on the very top, and so what I'm gonna do is actually flip this all around like this, because now what we're going to do is mark out how far up we want our interior portion of the shelf to be, and then we're going to throw a 1/4 inch dado on there, or you can do it as an 1/8 inch with 2 steps. And then we're going to go ahead and put a groove so that we can actually fit the bottom of our drawer in. Okay, so then the next steps are going to be to set the depth over here and to figure out how far up your board you want to take it. Both of these I actually just kind of eyeballed. There wasn't really a specific dimension outside of you don't want the depth to go more than about half the thickness of your wall, and then you also just, you don't want your shelf to be at the very bottom, and so I'm putting it about a 1/2 tooth up so that I've got about a 1/2 inch of interference. You can really play around with it. It's just meant to be sturdy enough. And then what we're going to do is we're going to cut this piece to match whatever our final dimensions are on this once the box is assembled, once we dry fit it together and see how it looks. So another thing, make sure that you are cutting the correct portion of this. For me, I'm going to be cutting this small-sided portion all the way across because that is going to be the inside of the box or the bottom of the box. And you want to make sure that you do that all the way around because, again, that is the kind of thing that I would screw up. And so I have to be extra careful about making sure I'm cutting both the inside and bottom of all of these different pieces. But here's a quick time lapse of that. Okie doke, and then a quick dry fit to make sure that everything fits nicely together and that all the grooves line up. Alrighty, and then after the last dry fit, everything looks good. You can see that the groove lines up all the way around the end. One of the things that I am noticing is that when you do a finger joint like this, you're either going to cut through the finger of the long side or the finger of the short side, which means that you will end up with a hole in the box down here. I guess it's interesting to make a finger joint box like this, but if you're going to try and put a slot in there, you may need to cut short of the end so that you don't pop through. Shouldn't affect the structural integrity, but it doesn't look quite as nice as it could. But let's go ahead and get the inside cut right over here behind the tripod, and then we'll see how it looks like when it's put together. And then now with that dry fit, we put the bottom of the shelf in here. Everything seems to fit just about perfectly. It does look like I may have cut it just a hair short in this direction, so go ahead and be careful when you're measuring that, but otherwise, this is gonna work just great for everything I'm looking to do. And this is basically it. I'm gonna go ahead and just skip over the gluing step because literally you're just going to, well, I won't skip over it here. I'll just give you a quick time lapse of me gluing this thing together and clamping it. In this case, you're probably not going to be able to use the wraparound that I had used in previous, the frame clamp that locks on all four corners, because you've got a little bit of overhang on these. But what you can do is put a clamp just inside on top and bottom on all of these, but that would be 2, 4, 6, 8 clamps. So make sure you've got plenty of clamps to make that happen. But here's me gluing it up real fast. Okay, there we go, all glued up and actually ready to go. So one of the things that I did learn is that none of my clamps were big enough. The short clamps were not big enough for the short width, and my long clamps, my long quick grips, were not long enough for the big length, and so I didn't have enough to do tops and bottoms, and so what I did is I just clamped it in the middle all the way around, which, because the wood can support the weight pretty well, it holds it in decently, but not perfect. So the old woodworking adage of you can never have enough clamps is true again in this case, because some of my clamps did not work for the clamping that I needed. So thank you guys again for joining me. I really appreciate it. If you have any questions about what I did, go ahead and leave it in the comment section down below. If you have any suggestions on how to do this better, I would love it if you leave that in the comment section down below as well. I, again, am still learning all of this as well. So if you have a better way of doing it, I would love to hear from you. So thank you guys in advance for joining. And if you like the content we're producing, we'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. Our channel is growing, and I'm really excited to be sharing with more of you guys and getting to reach more of you guys. So thank you guys for joining the community. I really appreciate it. So at any rate, thank you guys tons. Happy woodworking. Talk to you later.